The Poetics of Modernism. Modernists took their inspiration from varieties of sources. Yeats took it from occult, Irish myth and legends, romantics, and French symbolists. Proust drew from the insights of Bergson. Virginia Woolf on Bergson and G. Moore. Ezra Pound drew his inspiration from various non-European literatures as well as French writers. T.S. Eliot, whose poetic vision was profoundly eclectic, drew on Dante, the metaphysical poets, and a number of philosophers. Literary modernism was marked by a number of features. First, the affirmation of a continuity rather than separation between the worlds of subject and object, the self and the world. The human self is not viewed as a stable entity which simply engages with an already present external world of objects and other selves. 2. A perception of the complex roles of time, memory, and history in the mutual construction of self and the world. Time is not conceived as a static model which separates past, present, and future as discrete elements in a linear relationship. It is viewed as dynamic, with these elements influencing and changing one another. Human history is therefore not already written. Even the past can be altered in accordance with present human interests, motives, and viewpoints. 3. A breakdown of any linear narrative structure following the conventional Aristotelian model which prescribes beginning, middle, and end. Modernist poetry tends to be fragmented, creating its own internal logic of emotion, image, sound, symbol, and mood. 4. An acknowledgement of the complexity of experience. Any given experience is vastly more complex than it can be rendered in literal language. For example, the experience of love could be quite different from one person to another. Yet, language coercively subsumes these differing experiences under the same word and concept. Modernist poetry tends to veer away from any literal use of language, which might presume a one-to-one correspondence between words and things. It relies on suggestion and allusion rather than overt direct statements. 5. A self-consciousness regarding the process of literary composition. This embraces both an awareness of how one's own work relates to the literary tradition as a whole and an ironic stance toward the content of one's own work. Finally, an awareness of the problematic nature of language. If there is no simple correspondence between language and reality, and if these realms are mutually constituted through patterns of coherence, then a large part of the poet's task lies in more precise use of language, which offers alternative definitions of reality. Eliot once said that the poet must distort language in order to create his meaning. French symbolism was introduced to English and American audiences largely through Arthur Symons' book, The Symbolist Movement in Literature. In this book, Symons explained the history and rationale of French symbolism, which he saw as a reaction against 19th century scientism and materialism. French symbolism saw literature as affirming the reality of a higher spiritual realm, which could be discovered not by rational thought, but only in glimpses through a pure poetic language divested of any representational pretension. Symbolism is an attempt to reinvest both the world and language with metaphor, ambivalence, and mystery. In symbolist poetry, concrete images are used to evoke emotions, moods, and atmospheres otherwise ineffable. Yeats' own theory and practice of symbolism drew from William Blake, Shelley, Irish mythology, and magic. Yeats affirmed that external objects and scenes could express the profoundest internal states, and the poet's task is to imbue such scenes and images with a symbolic significance transcending the time and place of their immediate origin. Symbols for Yeats evoke what he calls a great mind and great memory. Yeats's own poetry uses numerous symbols with both private and public associations. Yeats worked out his own highly intricate cosmological symbolism in his work A Vision. His assessments of most poets were motivated by a search for symbolic predecessors and an attempt to explain their own techniques. T.S. Eliot's assumptions underlying his renowned critical notions such as tradition, dissociation of sensibility, and objective correlative were derived in part from French writers. Eliot's conception of dissociation of sensibility, according to which a dissociation of thought from feeling had arisen subsequent to the metaphysical poets. Eliot's major critical contributions were to combat provincialism by broadening the notion of tradition to include Europe, to advocate the prevailing critical impressionism, a closely analytical and even objective criticism, which positioned literary works alongside one another in the larger context of tradition. In this, he contributed to the development of notions of artistic autonomy, which were taken up by some of the new critics. And finally, to foster his own re-evaluation of the literary tradition, a dynamic notion of tradition as always in the process of change. Ezra Pound promoted his own work and the works of figures such as Frost, Joyce, and Eliot. He translated numerous texts from Anglo-Saxon, Latin, Greek, and Chinese, and associating with various schools such as Imagism and Vorticism, he advocated a poetry which was concise, concrete, precise in expression of emotion, and appropriately informed by a sense of tradition. As a result of his suggestions, Eliot's major poem The Wasteland was radically condensed and transformed. The ideas of Pound and Eliot have had a lasting influence, but their most forceful impact occurred between the 1920s and the 1940s.